Jones.
Good afternoon. I'd also like to welcome to the stage Daniel Gregory, who's CEO of PAWSEN. In September 2013, our city of Boulder, Colorado faced catastrophic flooding. Over the course of 9 days, over 16 inches of rain fell, close to our average annual precipitation, taking 4 lives in the region, requiring extensive evacuation, damaging or destroying 1,000 homes, and requiring the repair of county roads costing over $100 million. This crisis presented a wake-up call to protect the city's municipal and energy infrastructure, and has presented the opportunity to develop a resilience strategy that focuses on social and financial as well as technical strategies. And as an inaugural member of the 100 Resilient Cities Network, Boulder has pledged to pursue citywide sustainability and resiliency goals, including the rapid transition from an existing fossil fuel energy-based system to one that prioritizes local clean energy sources. So I'm particularly pleased to announce a new commitment, Boulder Building a Resilient City, with PAWSEN, a leader in devising sustainable and secure energy infrastructure solution. This is an exciting new partnership between the City of Boulder, Schneider Electric, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and 100 Resilient Cities. Through this commitment, PAWSEN will not only design and implement low-cost clean energy systems in the City of Boulder that will provide secure and continuous access to power when the electric grid is disrupted by natural disasters or other crises, but it will identify technical strategies that support our community values to reduce emissions and energy usage on a daily basis. These clean energy systems will provide power for day-to-day operations of critical city services at 5 initial locations, including a joint city-county emergency operations and data management center, a public transportation fleet and dispatch center, 2 community emergency sheltering sites, and our wildfire command and evacuation center. These clean energy systems will serve as models for integrating resiliency measures throughout Boulder, as well as throughout other communities as well. It is my pleasure to present this certificate to PAWSEN in recognition of this partnership and the company's leadership role in protecting Boulder's residents and its economic well-being.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Founder and Executive Director, National Geographic Pristine Seas, Enrique Sala.
Good afternoon. My name is Enrique Sala. I'm Explorer in Residence at the National Geographic Society and lead Pristine Seas, a project dedicated to protecting the last wild places on Earth, on the ocean. Because of global overfishing, pollution, climate change, fish stocks and the livelihoods they support are collapsing worldwide, marine dead zones are growing, and a litany of horrors that I'm not going to repeat here. At the CGI annual meeting 2 years ago, Pristine Seas committed to inspire country leaders to protect the last pristine places in the ocean, those last wildernesses that are mostly untouched, remote, and rich in biodiversity. The health of these places is key, is essential for the ocean to provide food, generate oxygen, capture our carbon pollution, and increase resilience to climate change. To date, Pristine Seas has helped to protect 12 of the 20 targeted wildest places in the ocean, covering a total area of 3.2 million square kilometers. These include the recent marine sanctuary in the Galapagos Islands of Ecuador and the Franz Josef Land National Park in the Russian Arctic, created just a month ago. Going forward, we hope to help protect 8 additional places, or maybe more. To identify and preserve ocean places, Pristine Seas conducts expeditions, scientific research, produces media, and partners with wonderful partners like the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, Wade Foundation, Oceana, and others, and country leaders. Major criteria in deciding how we choose these places, to preserve these places, is the costs and benefits of creating a reserve there, and also the ability of the countries that own these places to monitor and enforce them. Over the next 3 years, this commitment will have more than doubled the fully protected ocean area globally since 2014. And we believe that it is imperative that we protect these last beacons of ocean wilderness for the benefit of our planet and all its inhabitants. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome co-founder, Good, Max Shore.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel. We have a great session on COP21 and the time for urgent climate action is now. This is an issue that doesn't really need to be explained. We've all been living it, breathing it. We've been feeling it where we live increasingly. And it became very real for us at Good last year when we knew the momentum was happening for COP21 and we wanted to do something about it. We ended up being a part of building the Earth to Paris Coalition and putting an enormous amount of attention to build a coalition to really deal with, to build as much public engagement as we could around COP21. Today, we're here to look at how last December, 195 countries came together to really lay out a roadmap for bold action on climate change. We're going to talk about how this type of multinational agreement can happen. We're going to talk about public-private partnership. We're going to talk about where there's need right now, what needs to happen, and we're going to talk about how you and we together can spur innovation and action to really make sure that we realize this bold Paris Agreement. So thank you all for being here. I am now going to be joined by Luis Moreno, who's the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, and Ria Sa, who is the president of NRDC. All right, so this session is around urgency for action. And first we want to talk about threats to some communities that are, have more of a threat. And so Luis, you've been doing a lot of work in Latin America, and it's astonishing, but it sounds like 30% of airports and 20% of some of the prioritized tourist areas are at threat of completely disappearing if sea level rises by a meter. And so you've been doing cutting edge work on adaptation. Maybe you can share a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, let me begin by saying that in speaking about Latin America and the Caribbean represent about anywhere from 8 to 9% of the land mass of the world. And Latin America is home to about 32% of the biodiversity of the world. At the same time, if you look at the 10 countries in the world which are the most vulnerable, about half of them are in Latin America. So it's not a small thing. On the other hand, if you look at one of the places of the world which has the cleanest energy matrix, the least emissions of CO2, again, is Latin America. So there's a hugely important area of the world for these precise reasons. Now, you mentioned, of course, in the event that we hope it doesn't happen, but notwithstanding, countries have to plan. And typically, it is countries that are the most vulnerable, that are the most poor, that have the biggest challenges. So the question becomes, how do you address that? What do you do? And certainly, if you look down in the next 20 years, the single biggest source of emissions in Latin America will come from the necessary upgrades of infrastructure and the build of infrastructure that we're going to have in the next 2 decades. And so that means that how we prepare ourselves for that scenario will be critical. In terms of adaptation, in any climate change discussion, this is probably the single most difficult issue, as I'm sure you'll hear from my colleague here in the panel. Why? Because I think it requires not only a national but a local dimension as well. Take, for instance, energy. Nicaragua was a country where we worked very closely with. 10 years ago, Nicaragua had 50% of its whole country without access to electricity. And that electricity in that country was about 80% coming from fossil fuels. Working with them with geothermal, with renewables, today Nicaragua is 85% penetration of energy and growing very quickly. But more importantly is the shift that took place in terms away from fossil fuels and into renewables. So these are the kinds of things that you need to do in adaptation. They take a long time. And at the end, they require, blended finance, which I'm happy to get into later.
And now, Ria, you're doing a lot of legal and policy work with the NRDC, and you're looking also at how most vulnerable communities are threatened and how you can protect them. So could you share some of what's working for you in that area?
I'd be happy to. So let me first say thank you. It's really wonderful to be here, and even more wonderful to be able to be here to talk about this issue. I'm just looking at the screenshot and the title of this session. It's actually a bit of my mantra. I've been talking over the last several months about the reality that I think climate as an issue has really landed. And I talk about the moment that we're in with kind of the aftermath of Paris, with the momentum that still continues of this really amazing window of opportunity. But with that sense of optimism is also a very stark sense of reality, and I'll just speak from the perspective of a U.S. citizen and looking at the elections. It's a pretty astonishing thing where, again, while I feel like we've really landed this issue politically, you look at the platform of one of the parties, I mean, it's just as deep as you can possibly get on where climate policy should evolve, not only to meet our Paris commitments, but to exceed them. And you contrast that with the other party that actually doesn't even believe it's an issue, right? It's not even that there's like a difference in opinion about the issue. It's that one party thinks it's an issue and the other party doesn't even think it exists as an issue. So there's a pretty major existential crisis happening with respect to how we grapple with this as a country. But I am very confident that for the most part, and you see this in every public opinion poll, whether you're a registered Democrat or a registered Republican, the majority of Americans believe that climate is real, man-made, and needs urgent action. So when we think about the types of actions that are required beyond the governmental commitments, I think, our moral obligations to the folks that are already confronting the realities of climate change. As we know, there is a price to pay for climate chaos, and in many ways, there's communities around the globe that have borne a greater burden of our dependence on fossil fuels. Every city in this country is an example of some communities that live directly in the shadows of industrial development, of fossil fuel plants, of big power generating stations. And so thinking about this impact is something that we increasingly are spending time on at NRDC, and thinking about the opportunities to right some of these longstanding wrongs, I think, is one of the biggest opportunities in thinking about advancing a clean energy economy. It is not simply the climate goals that we aspire to, but it's also the equity goals that I think we have an equal, if not better, shot at achieving.
And then, Luis, in terms of incentivizing action, so for the most part, although not completely, this issue has landed, and people realize the science is real. We see it. We see the water in Miami. We see it in Latin America. We see it all over the world. We're going to hear from the Marshall Islands in the second part of this. But now it gets to how do we actually, we know we need to take action, but how do we incentivize action? And finance was such a big part of the Paris Agreement. And in terms of realizing this goal, it's a huge part. So what are you seeing that works really well in terms of incentivizing finance, using finance to incentivize the right action, working with governments and business?
Look, the most important thing is what we have today is an agreement where everybody agrees on a set of goals, some of which will begin in 2020 and going forward when you really get into the action mode side of this. But between today and then, in 2020, we have to do a lot of work. The central work is this, as I see it. Countries made promises of reductions of emissions, but those promises have to be brought down to earth in terms of actual programs that countries, as a result, develop such that those reductions in emissions take place. So the first part that you need to work is a combination of somewhere you need to create the amount of funding that will allow governments to begin to turn those action plans into actual projects. And that's not going to happen simply because you say it, but rather because you have grants where you help develop that part. At the same time, and going into this whole, green economy discussion, they have to be economically feasible. Mm-hmm. And more, the way we see it is that you require some kind of blended finance, where you can get very long tenors, where you can get low interest rates for countries to take on many of these needs. And certainly having in mind the most vulnerable countries, because they are the ones with some of the larger challenges. If you look at where climate finance was prior to Paris, and according to an OECD study, almost 60% of the total financing for climate was being done by institutions like the IDB or the World Bank or other international financial institutions. And I think you need either those institutions to have a bigger muscle and, or more importantly, the capacity to mobilize funding from the private sector. Mm-hmm. And here what we need to develop is the set of standards that determine what is green climate financing. Because today there is not a universal standard, and that's fundamental, such that institutional investors and crossover investors who want to be in this space can actually invest. And I think that there is a huge amount of interest. I think there is sufficient knowledge, partly by the work that you and others have done, to create the awareness. But I think now the tricky part is getting all of the piping for all of this to happen. And this is no small challenge.
And I guess just on the subject of that challenge, just staying with you for 1 second, is there a concern, and is there stuff that people here in the room can do to help make sure that we don't just sort of not be able to incentivize this action? It feels like, obviously last December was a big signal. It feels like society is moving in this direction. But are there gaps or areas that you're working on, that people here are working on, that are important to fill to make sure that we realize the Paris Agreement?
Well, I mean, there's a lot that can be done in how, for instance, take Latin America, and you heard President Macri this morning. Latin America needs to to double its amount of investment in infrastructure, and about half of that investment is going to be in energy. And he was talking this huge potential that in the Patagonia and other places in Argentina they have for say, wind energy. That, in essence, is building up a sufficient base load that over time you can have smarter grids that can accommodate the different kinds of energy sources. And on the consumer side, more and more awareness of the people in the kind of energy they're consuming. Some energy companies have done this, but this is hugely important. And I think today we're in a world where, thanks to technology, solar cells have come down in price significantly. We see a variety of projects taking place around Latin America. In this case, the best example is perhaps Chile, that in the space of 3 years went from almost no solar energy to close to over 100 megawatts in solar already in projects that have been approved. So there is, the economic feasibility there, but you got to create the incentives, and you got to create the awareness from governments who are willing to participate in this. And at the same time, I think the public opinion around this issue is very critical to stay alive, well, and healthy.
And Ria, you've worked inside of the government, you've worked in philanthropy, you've worked for a nonprofit. What are you seeing as key to incentivizing and pushing forward this action right now?
So I actually think that it's important to realize that there are actually a ton of energy incentives that are out there. They're not necessarily incentivizing the right kind of energy, right? So I think when you talk about the incentives for a clean energy economy or for climate action, I think you need to recognize that there is an enormous amount of existing subsidies that go to fossil fuel industries that are permanent. The United States just renewed our commitment to wind and solar tax credits. Those tax credits need to be renewed every 5 years, every 7 years. Oil and gas industry has something like $4.7 billion of subsidies that are permanent. And so if you really want to level the playing field, if you really want to create the opportunity for these new technologies, these cleaner energy systems to truly compete on an even playing field, I think you need to broaden out the conversation around incentives to ensure that, again, the playing field is even. The one additional thing that I'll say beyond incentives, subsidies, tax credits, there needs to be, certainly within the context of the United States, but I believe this is true globally, there needs to be a combination of carrots and sticks. The stick that President Obama created through the Clean Power Plan is, for the first time in the history of the United States, an effort to regulate carbon as a pollution systematically throughout the country. If you don't have the basic framework of regulation, if you don't have the kind of established parameters for what it is you're trying to do with respect to climate action, it's very hard for the incentive structure, I think, to be leveraged as much as it could be. I think those two things absolutely need to go hand in hand. So it is the regulatory environment that hopefully stimulates the public, private, and private side of the equation with long-term investments, with market signals that really kind of create, I think, again, the kind of trajectory for the type of economic revolution that we're talking about.
Is there an example that strikes you where something that's working, where you want to do more of this? Either a partnership or some lending you've done, or an initiative of NRDC. Is there something that's working that you're either doing or seeing that is encouraging you about what can happen going forward?
No, I think there's a lot of things that are working, especially around energy efficiency, around the awareness of the need to begin to change the energy matrices in many countries, especially as you think how they are expanded. I think there's a lot of awareness in that space, in the area of mass transit. We've done, for instance, in the city of Bogota, the way of how there were millions of tons of CO2 that were generated by a BRT system. This is the rapid bus transit systems, and how to switch those buses that were consuming diesel to make them into hybrid buses that can be either electric. That technology still needs to be developed. The Chinese have done some things. There's other countries that are doing, experimental work where you at least can, run an electric bus for a sufficient number of hours, but do it on natural gas, for instance. So those, and then creating the kind of financial instrument that will allow the owner of those buses or the group of those buses to then switch to a much more expensive type of asset, but that in turn will create the types of reductions of emissions. And here, these are a set of family of funds that have been created over time. These were part where the climate funds that were housed at the World Bank. There's now the Green Climate Fund, which basically looks to do things in both the private and the public space. We did, for instance, a project from Mexico on down through Central America to create what we call green bonds that are focused on SMEs, such that if they have the old refrigerator or the old air conditioning, they will switch into more energy efficiency type of projects. So I think in that space, there's been a lot of activity taking hold. Equally, I think the regulatory part, which is much more complex inside governments, and how you mainstream this, because this is an activity that you cannot only focus on certain parts of an economy. More and more, they will be throughout the whole economy. And the way we think about this is one of the things we did was to reorganize ourselves to be fit for purpose, such that every loan, we lend close to $12 billion a year to governments, and close to $2.5 billion to businesses throughout Latin America. And in every project that we do, we ask ourselves the question, how can we be more energy efficiency regardless of what space you're working in?
Are you seeing things that, or yeah, I don't. I mean, I can open it up to you as well if you want to make a broader point. But is there an area of your current work that you see as sort of most important and most vital right now?
Maintaining, continuing, and expanding U.S. leadership on climate action, starting with implementing the President's Clean Power Plan, and hopefully in the next administration building upon that in all of the dimensions that we need to, from supply to demand.
And where does public awareness, Luis talked a little bit about how public awareness helps, and it's this interplay between political leadership and public awareness and policy. How do those two play together for you? How do you see that?
Well, again, I think all of the polling that we've done recently has demonstrated that Americans do believe in climate change and believe in the need for action. How that gets translated politically into the kind of leadership that we need in all levels of government is something that we are working very hard to try to kind of make the connection to help make the connection for individuals. But I do feel that we have kind of, in some ways, kind of gotten past this watershed moment where it's no longer necessarily a debate. It's a reality, whether it's the massive flooding that we saw in multiple cities across the country over the summer, the ongoing droughts in California, the just unbelievable heat waves that we're seeing in parts of Southeast Asia. I mean, these are now the extraordinary weather events are not so extraordinary anymore. And I think most Americans kind of realize that and are not only interested, but very, I think, compelled to try to do something about it, from from a moralistic, a kind of global perspective, but also from a very individualistic perspective. I mean, if you are a homeowner in the city of Miami or Norfolk, Virginia, or pretty much any coastal low-lying area now in the United States, you're thinking about this. And so, again, how do we close the gap between that increased awareness and the political leadership action that it demands?
You know, one of the things to your point is the following. This is not only important at the federal government or the national governments, but equally at the state and local governments. And where you see a lot of advances taking place every day, no surprises at the local government level. Why? Because mayors deal with this immediately. They don't have a lot of space to imagine what they're going to do. They have to act. And I think this is very important in terms of keeping together the kind of movement that we need to see, combined with what governments will do in the way of policies and providing the instruments to finance into this new economy.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think as was evidenced by the mayor of Boulder's commitment, I mean, the innovation in many ways is happening at the local level. And it's the national leaders that are following the lead of local leaders. And I think that's a very interesting and very compelling and very exciting development for this issue overall.
Absolutely. And good, it's fun being here because so many luminaries and senior leaders are here in the room, and we're joined by, but good really has come of age as a platform for millennials and younger adults. And we find that they are so strong on this issue and so passionate about this issue. And so as we've started to do more, we've just seen kind of an overwhelming response, from that, and it isn't as much represented here. I'm on the leading edge of the millennials. I'm born in 1980, but young people going up, I think, reinforce this message so much. But with this, we'd love to open it up for a couple of questions from the audience. We have a hand up over there.
Hi, my name is Stefan Tanda with DSM. Thanks for the great panel. I wanted to get your perspective on the role of agriculture in contributing to climate change. I think we often now feel with energy and transportation, there's the outlines of how we're going to make progress. Next in line is agriculture, particular ruminants. Basically, one cow is 2 family sedans in terms of climate impact. And not throwing rocks, we're part of the industry, supplying and engaging with customers around can you reduce, for example, methane impact of cows. But how do you think about the role of addressing the climate impact of agriculture, and in particular Latin America, obviously a huge producer in that field? Thank you.
Well, certainly this is the biggest source of emissions in Latin America is precisely through agriculture. And so there's a variety of ways. Certainly, I think the introduction of technology in countries like Brazil or Argentina, where you have precision-type agriculture, seeds that are developed especially for those countries, has allowed them, in the case of both Argentina and Brazil, to double the production of grains in the space of 10 years without really extending the agricultural frontier. The other question is, how do you capture these methane gases? How do you do this, not thinking of the cow, but thinking of the whole process? And I think this is the part that we're missing, and this is countries like Brazil who made a big commitment on the reduction of emissions. This is the kind of thing that they're working. But again, this will provide equally for a huge space for technological development, which is already happening in these countries. I mean, this is something that gets seldom spoken about, but the advances in technology in agriculture that you see in countries like Argentina and Brazil are really in the frontier, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, and there's so many ways to answer that, but I mean, the consciousness and the way people eat and the way people respond to their food system, we're seeing start to really change in a lot of ways. Innovations on food that tastes a lot like meat but isn't quite meat, is coming up as well, and many things in addition. But were there other questions? Yes, here in the middle of the room. Do we have a microphone? Or?
Matt Peterson, Chief Sustainability Officer for Mayor Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles. Appreciate the nod to local leaders. We're definitely trying to innovate. On Friday, we passed a 100% renewables motion to study how we get there for our utility, which is going from 50% coal to 50% renewables and hopefully to 100% renewables. A question, being involved in C40, which is a global organization of mayors, one of the struggles we see for cities is being able to get from the pilot to scale, particularly for cities in the global south. What do you see for financing opportunities that you're thinking about, or you might see a RIA out there that could be helpful to cities in the global south?
Well, as you know well, the C40 actually, when you had the Rio Plus 20, or even in some of these climate change discussions, you saw the room where the negotiators were, and we have a good testimony to that. Christiana, who you will see in a minute, she would tell you it was the mayors that were way ahead of the governments in actually doing things individually as mayors or as a collection of mayors. But certainly the bigger challenge, take the case of Mexico City. So if you want to reduce significantly emissions in the city of like the DF in Mexico, you really need to change the system of transportation in ways that politically is very difficult. In taking away old cars, old buses, those things are easier said than done. And in my view, what is central to all of these challenges is finding the kind of blended finance instruments that allow for cities to take those kinds of risks. Because a city in the global south, as you described, has more challenges than financing to meet those challenges. So how those priorities are set will largely depend on this. And this is something that I wish, as you think more in your policy discussion, because this is a world problem. This is about our global commons. The United States, and she would tell you, still use a lot of coal. We use far less coal in Latin America, Rolando will validate this for me, than the United States. So the point is, how do we get the kind of blended finance that we need to encourage countries in the global south, as you described, to be able to do the kinds of changes that are needed, because at the end of the day, it is the most vulnerable countries, the one that need the most help.
It's very hard to add to that. I mean, I think that was an extraordinary answer. I will just say that I do see an additional delta between the aspirations and visions that a lot of local leaders have and the technical blueprints to make those visions a reality. So even within the United States, but also in China and in India, we're trying to use our technical expertise of more than 40 years of actually working on utility reform or grid updating to help local leaders really map out how they get from A to Z. And I think the financing, it has been a big, open, missing piece, but one that I think has extraordinary opportunities. And it is not only blended finance instruments, but it is also really bringing in the private sector and leveraging the private sector to invest more heavily in local communities, in infrastructure in local communities, in a way that can not only be sustainable, but also potentially profitable.
Last question.
Terry Tamminen with the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. I wanted to ask you, and if Christiana's going up later, we'll ask her this now as well, what role you think a price on carbon plays in all of this? Are we fooling ourselves with all the things that we're talking about doing in terms of that really being the solution without a price on carbon? And I don't necessarily just mean a tax on carbon, could be cap and trade system or something else. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about, must we have a price on carbon? If so, how high? And thirdly, what your preferred method would be of implementing that globally. Easy question.
Thank you, Terry. I appreciate that. So I will say, as you know, there's a lot of conversation right now around carbon pricing, carbon tax, cap and trade system. I think there's a renewed sense, at least within the United States, of the opportunity to talk about legislative approaches for climate action, and I think those are all incredibly important conversations to be had. I think it's important to try to pursue a legislative approach to climate action, and it's something that we haven't in the United States done in about 6 years. So it's an important vehicle, it's an important venue, but I don't think it's a panacea. I don't think a carbon tax is going to get to the emissions reductions that we need in all of the sectors that we need it. It's an important tool that we should have in the toolbox, but it is only one tool, and it doesn't necessarily, again, represent the breadth of the kind of reductions in the type of sectors that we really need to get to. I mean, that's why I'm really very inspired by the earlier comments about agriculture, by the broader dimensions that we're beginning to grapple with and innovate within, that this isn't simply about power plants or tailpipes, right? This is an all of the above needed strategy for climate action. And again, carbon tax, carbon pricing can be part of the solution, but it is not the solution in and of itself.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, but we will try to blend that thread into the next session if we can. Please give a round of applause for our panelists. And a filmmaker for good is in the room, Gabe, who could raise his hand, but he made a film that we're going to play in the intermission. And what's amazing about this film is it uses NASA composite imagery to show the world breathing. And we're at a moment like when we could first see the full world, where we're realizing that we are part of, one system. And what's amazing is we first made a video that was very beautiful, and it only about 50,000 people saw this video, and then Gabe sort of recut the video, made it with slightly different music and a slightly different message, and over 25 million people saw that video. And we also made a video with Solar City that over 25 million people saw, and what's amazing is they all saw it through Facebook, because they saw this message and they wanted to share it with people. So we'll give you a taste of this video. This is a version of the video that 25 million people saw of a breathing Earth that we now need to protect.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back our moderator, Max Shore. And our panelists. Former Executive Secretary, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Christiana Figueres. Minister of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Marshall Islands, John M. Silk. Chairman, Global Partnerships, Swiss Re, Martin Parker.
All right, so now we are into the meat of our session. We've kind of gotten into it, and what would be great is we're gonna talk in three ways. We're gonna first look back at COP21. We have an incredible panel to do that with, and then we are going to look at public-private partnerships, and then finally looking forward at action. So first, Christiana, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts around, you played such an extraordinary role as the world came together for this Paris Agreement. And when did you actually have a strong sense that we were going to make a breakthrough deal? And what were some key moments actually in the 2 weeks of the negotiations?
Thanks very much, and hello, everyone. Wonderful to be here again. I've never heard the Earth being described as a breathing rock. I think that is actually quite a wonderful description that I have now incorporated into my lingo. So a breathing rock to which we're all clinging on. The other part of that we have to realize is that breathing rock is going to continue breathing no matter what, right? It's us who need to get with the program here. But the planet will continue with or without us. But anyway, back to here to the concrete. So actually, this was really a monumental 6-year effort. But I would say that there was a critical mass of us who knew around the Lima COP a whole year before Paris, we knew that we were going to get an agreement because we could see the political chessboard already laid out in front of us pretty clearly. We knew that we had a critical mass of support. We knew that most of the difficult political issues had been addressed, or we knew that we had in our pocket something to address the political issues. So, and we knew that we had a very, very important support from corporations, from investors, and from insurance companies that really had understood not necessarily that they wanted to come out in support of the breathing rock, but that they wanted to come out in support of their own continuity, just because it made sense to them. And so a whole year ahead of time, we knew that we had an agreement, which was a really fantastic situation to be in a whole year ahead of time, because it then allowed us to move in a double track over the last 12 months. One was to dig into the technical details of the design of the agreement, but we knew that that would move forward. But perhaps more importantly, to focus on the ambition of the agreement. And that is the piece that was really quite wonderful, to be able to have the luxury to have a whole 12 months to push for an ambitious agreement.
Fantastic. And Minister Silk, part of what happened in Paris was the High Ambition Coalition, island states coming together with and building a coalition of industrializing nations, island states, and some industrialized nations as well. The EU and the US joined the coalition. What worked well about that partnership, and how can we learn from that and take that going forward?
Well, thank you for having me here. As you know, my president is supposed to be sitting here, but she came down with the flu. But going back to your question, I was not involved in the Paris Agreement. I was not in Paris. But about 6 years ago, I was in Copenhagen. And at that time, I was part of the delegation from the Marshall Islands that went into the negotiations. And we were very frustrated when we got out of the negotiations in Copenhagen. And so when we got back home, we started to rethink the whole approach to these negotiations. And we started talking with within the region itself, the Forum Island countries. Part of the strategy was to formulate a strategy that encompasses the entire Forum Island countries instead of one individual country going forward with these negotiations. And then working with people like Christina here and other members of the bigger community, including the private sector. I think that's what happened in Paris. But I think it's really a combination of individual small island countries working alongside bigger countries and private sector and donors that make the difference.
And Martin, you've been engaged in these climate conversations for a while now, a couple decades, and you come from your position at Swiss Re in the reinsurance industry, looking at some of the risks and some of the kind of financial realities that will play out as climate change becomes more of a reality for more people. How has the conversation changed with you? How did it change around COP21, and why was that the right time?
Max, thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's certainly in great company. Every year, weather events sent by Mother Nature cause about $50 billion of economic damage. And from an insurance industry perspective, that might be a scary number, but in actual fact, only about 20 or 25% of that economic damage is currently insured. That's an average number, a global number. It's probably grown in real numbers by tenfold in 20 years, partly because of urbanization and concentration of assets in those urban areas, which humans seem to like to live by the coast, where some of these things are very exposed. But those percentages of covered economic damage vary a lot between developing nations and the mature economies, of course. So it's a real issue out there. And I think one of the reasons the insurance companies have been invited to the dialogue, and Swiss Re was the only private company to accompany the Swiss government, but one of the reasons we're here is because of our ability to act as a financial shock absorber when these things come along. And we've heard about some of the financing challenges and the amounts of money that will need to be invested to help society, countries, cities, and so on become resilient. If you have a natural catastrophe which really is harmful to your budget, causes great volatility, that's very inconvenient at the time. So I think the insurance industry has a place to play there. In COP21, there was actually a paragraph that said we would establish a clearinghouse for risk transfer and facilitate the implementation of comprehensive risk management strategies. And I think it's the risk management strategies that the insurance industry can also bring along in a very forward-looking way. We do a lot of R&D in this area as well.
And so some of these realities, I mean, there's tens of billions of dollars that are real devastation from these climate events. The climate events are happening more frequently. Cities feel that, and we heard from Matt. Now cities are getting up front. But Christiana, in Paris, the private sector and government came together. And what did you find to be the sort of what is can we learn from this multilateral agreement and this public-private partnership that happened in Paris? Like, how can we take this forward? How can the people in the room learn from what works?
Well, if I could jump on the data, Martin, that you shared, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the natural disasters are covered only 25% of them globally. But if you take the global south as your universe, that actually drops down into single digits. And that is really the problem, okay? That's really the problem, because it is the developing countries that are most vulnerable, that have the least financial, political, institutional, social capacity to deal with these issues, and they are the worst insured. And so I think that one of the major steps forward that need to be done, and where Swiss Re is already taking a lead, is actually moving into new insurance schemes that are actually going to help developing countries in particular to deal with the new risks that they're facing, because it was, if my memory doesn't betray me, it was actually Swiss Re who was the first reinsurance company to say publicly, and then joined by many other insurance companies, such that it is now a statement across the board of the insurance sector that if we should get to a world that does go above 2 degrees, That is a word that is uninsurable. I mean, that is a stark statement. How can you possibly do business in a world that is uninsurable? How can you possibly develop any social strength, any economic growth, anything in a world that is by definition uninsurable because the risks are so high that you cannot increase the premiums to meet the risks? So it is a major issue. And it's a very good example of your question because, to even begin to question about, can we do without a private-public agreement or a public-private collaboration, it's a little bit like asking, well, how can we take the ship, from point of departure to point of destination across the ocean? Do we have to choose between the bridge and the engine room? No. You need both. You need the bridge because the direction has to be set, and that is the role of national governments, to a certain extent also subnational governments. They have to set the direction, they have to set the pace. But the work, actually, the investments, the action on the ground comes from the private sector, from insurance, from investors. That's the engine room. And so you need both of these for their own benefit to understand that working together, they can work best. And yes, I do think that it is one of the major lessons learned of Paris, and one that would do us well to begin to think, how can we actually extend that lesson, not just to climate, but to all of the other SDGs, perhaps.
And taking the powerfully stated, and I think one of the most powerful examples that any of us have heard and imagined is the Marshall Islands. And Minister Silk, I mean, perhaps you can walk us through. I mean, we're talking about insurance, and we're thinking of cities, we're thinking of losing buildings and maybe some casualties. But with the Marshall Islands, we're looking at a situation where business as usual puts the entire nation underwater, or makes it no longer, something that can exist in the way it has. So perhaps you can, talk a little bit about the urgency for action in the context of your country. If we are able to realize the Paris Agreement, what might be the best case scenario for the Marshall Islands? Thank you. Well, we will.
No, thank you.
And
now you can continue your statement.
And I like
yes.
that. And we need a little tension in the band. Like, we will, and yet I have a little bit of uncertainty because it is a big thing that we all need to do together, and it's not something any one person, although Christiana, tried hard to disprove that one person can play a big role in, and so there can be a sense of complacency. Okay, we did this big agreement, so now it's all going to work out, and I think we all know that it has to happen, and more so. But thank you, we will. But why must we, Minister Silk?
Thank you. Before I answer that question, which is a very good question, I'd like to comment on Christina's answer to your question on. Let me put it this way: we have the third largest ship registry in the Marshall Islands. Yet we are determined to make sure that the shipping industry contributes their part to the reduction in gas emissions, and it's not because of anything else. We don't want to lose our shipping industry and registry, but at the same time, the ultimate goal is to make sure that we still have the Marshall Islands. We hand it back to our next generation and the generation after that. So going back to your question, what would be the best case scenario? The best case scenario is that Paris come into play, and it's very hard to answer that question without having to give you a little history background. Let me please give me the opportunity. The Marshall Islands, as you know, is 6 feet. It's spread over 800,000 square miles of water, and it is about 1,000 atolls and islands spread out. And the highest point is about 6 feet above sea level. So could you then try to imagine the people living there and thinking about what's going to happen should the sea level rise and continues to rise. Now, if if you go back to your history, you will realize that at some point in time, about 60 years ago, there was some nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. And a lot of those people in those atolls that were affected by the nuclear testing have migrated somewhere else because they can't live in their own atolls because it's contaminated. So if you were to say what happened if climate change continues and sea level rise, then we'll be faced with the obvious option, which would be to evacuate the rest of the Marshall Islands. And then where do we go to? So the question is, what is the best case scenario? Well, best case scenario is would be if one of these countries, the big emitters, were to say, okay, we'll take you in. We'll take you in should you lose your country. But we don't want to do that. We want to stay in our country. And part of our culture, you're identified with your land. And if you go somewhere else, and this is what's happened in the Marshall Islands, some of those people have been forced to leave their atolls because of the nuclear testing. But then they come and live in other parts of the Marshall Islands, but they don't belong because they're not part of their origin came from those part of the atolls that have been contaminated. And if I may just add a little bit more, I have a history of myself. I have 3 granddaughters. Their father is from the island of Bikini. Their mother is, of course, my daughter. And so their father will never go back to Bikini. His parents, were the ones who were evacuated from Bikini to make way for the nuclear testing. Their father and my granddaughters have never been back to Bikini, nor will they ever go back. I was fortunate enough to make a trip to Bikini and see the atoll. You can't live there, but you could go and visit. So, but if you can't live there, there's no reason why you should go back, because you can make a living out of it. So that's what I mean when you say it's a personal issue for me. I don't want to see my granddaughters or their children have to move off from the Marshall Islands, because if they move off the Marshall Islands, that's it. At least they have some connection with the rest of the Marshall Islands, not with Bikini, because you can't forget Bikini for the next 200,000 years. But at least they still have connection through their mother, who is from other parts of the Marshall Islands. So that's the way the culture plays. So I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
You have, and so we talk about insurance and how do you insure a country that may be no more. And Martin, you're working with governments and public-private partnerships, and how do we get ahead of this issue? And it's sort of a double-edged sword, if you will. I mean, it's like we need to protect it from a financial point of view because we see what is happening in terms of the implications of climate change. But at the same time, the call to action is even more urgent. How can Minister Silk's grandchildren still live in their homeland? And so how can you play that role on both sides?
Yeah, thanks, Max. I think there comes to a point where insurance isn't a solution. So the 2-degree world is not insurable. I'm afraid when an island is just 6 feet at the high point, it is going to be almost impossible for the insurance industry to offer a protection at a viable price.
The premium would be too high.
Yeah, and I think that's a big piece of what the insurance industry does. We put a price tag on risk. And a very simple example, if you come and ask me to insure your factory, which is stone-built, well-roofed, fire detection equipment, sprinklers, and it's inert materials, you'll get a different price to a wooden hut owned by a pyromaniac making fireworks. It's in a way we need to be resilient to be there to pay the claims at the end of the day. So price tag on a risk is very important. And the insurance industry does a lot of forward-looking research. I just want to mention this one. So Super Hurricane Sandy, 6 years before on a US documentary, my colleagues presented a super typhoon Hurricane Sandy example across New York and Manhattan. And the flood print that we predicted 6 years earlier was more than 80% fit to what actually happened. And the reason I bring it up is because the risk is known, but somehow the action to protect ourselves, firstly the mitigation and then possibly the risk transfer, seems to bypass us. And I don't know whether that's because the political timeline is too short and people are not making these big decisions. But I think when it comes to something like the 100 resilient cities that we've heard mentioned already, and Swiss Re is a partner to Rockefeller and very proud to be so, we're seeing some really tremendous work done there. So we're working with New Orleans at the moment with a company called Veolia. So Swiss Re and Veolia are both 150 years plus old. They're water and sanitation in the case of New Orleans. And they want to improve the resilience of the water and sanitation. But as we work together on the 100 Resilient Cities banner, we realize that events will still happen, resilience will still be challenged. And if there is an event which brings down the water and sanitation system, why not have a risk transfer there that takes the budget volatility away, puts the financing on the table very quickly, and enables that to be redressed much quicker than it would have done without that same protection. So those sorts of innovations are coming along in the dialogue. And one of the points to make there is it's a partnership. Again, it's people working across the public-private partnership spectrum to figure out what's possible, but then having the determination to implement.
So we heard the outrage about my saying if we realize. So now more, can we get into how can we realize? What is happening right now? We're getting ready for COP22 in Marrakesh. World leaders are meeting this week at the UN. And there are rumors that the Paris Agreement may go into force by the end of this year. How can we in the room, help to make sure that the Paris Agreement is realized, and how can we learn from this really unique moment that you presided over last year when the whole world came together and we had a multilateral agreement? How can we go forward from this?
Well, I think there's several buckets that need to be filled up pretty quickly. The first is the legal, and you've already mentioned that the Paris Agreement may come into force quite quickly. Originally, the global community had intended that the Paris Agreement would come into force in 2020. Unfortunately, because of all of the momentum that was built up, it's very possible that it will come into force either at the end of this year, after Marrakesh, or in the beginning of next year. So a whole 3 years ahead of time, which is very good news. That means that Paris Agreement is going to be legally binding in those countries that have ratified, and we would expect most, if not all, of the countries who adopted the agreement to then eventually ratify. So you would have a legally binding international legal structure for countries to then begin to devolve that into national level and subnational level also legal structures that need to be developed. So you do need that. You need the legislation, you need the regulation put in place in countries and in states, provinces, cities, in order to provide both the carrots and the sticks for the implementation of the agreement. So the legal bucket needs to be filled. You also need to look at the technology bucket, and there again, that is a collaboration, a partnership between private and public sector, because the public sector must continue to invest in the cutting-edge technologies that are not yet mature enough that they have come to market. They're not competitive yet, but we know that we will need more of those clean technologies, and that is a responsibility of the public sector. But the private sector needs to continue to disseminate the technologies that are already market driven and that are already very competitive in most areas, in most jurisdictions. So that needs to move forward, of course, hand in hand with the third bucket, which is the financial sector. And there again, there are responsibilities of the public sector in finance, and there are responsibilities in the private sector. And President Moreno has already talked about blended finance, which is the only way to move forward, because you do need some of the most difficult risks to be taken off the table. You need the political risk, you need the currency risk, perhaps. You need, some of the local risk to be taken off the table by public funding, whether that is the multilateral development banks or other types, or national funding. But you do need that risk to be taken off, so that can then leverage the kinds of investments that we need to see, because we're currently only at about 300 billion of investment per year into renewables. That's good, that's fine, but it is nowhere close to where we need to be. We need to be at $1 trillion a year over the next 10 to 15 years in order to make that agreement come down into the manageable temperature rise. So the finance bucket is another one that needs to be filled. So you see that there are many different buckets, and bucket actually is the wrong word for it because they are interconnected. You do have to see the interconnection between the legal, the technology, the finance, the policy. All of these are interconnected, and they all need to be working hand in hand in order to accelerate it as much as possible. And let me just be very clear about the fact that if there is something that the Paris Agreement did not do, it did not inject a sense of urgency into the transformation. And that is my only regret about the Paris Agreement, because the fact is that the Paris Agreement puts a final destination way off there, into the second half of the century. Well, in order to be where we need to be in the second half of the century, which is having restored the ecological balance between emissions and the natural absorption of the planet, we need to be making a difference today. And that means over the next 5 years. So I have constantly, ever since Paris, invited everyone, and here you are, your golden engraved invitation to swallow the alarm clock. Swallow the alarm clock, because this is urgent. It has to happen over the next 5 years. If we're not able to reach global peaking, that means the maximum level of emissions over the next 5 years, and then a very quick descent, we will close the door to 1.5, which means we will have the entire population of the Marshall Islands looking for another home. And we may endanger even the 2 degrees, which means we will have populations the size of Bangladesh, 30 million people looking also for other homes. It is a world that nobody wants. The Bangladeshis don't want it. The Marshall Islands don't want it. Nobody wants that kind of a situation. And in a world today where we already have 65 million people who are already displaced, 2/3 of them are displaced within their countries. 1/3 of them are already displaced beyond their boundaries. We know the pressure that Europe is under with 65 million people displaced. Now can you imagine if that's going to very quickly double, triple, or quadruple because of climate migration pressures? So this is a world we don't want. This is a world that the insurance company can't handle, and they don't want to handle it either. We want to make sure that we keep the risk and pain, human pain and human cost, within the marginal, within the manageable levels that we can. This is not, a fantastic situation that we're given, but we have to manage it, and we have to do it urgently in order to keep it within the boundaries of responsible management.
And the framework, to be clear, the framework allows for the transformation, but it doesn't set the pace. That's what you're saying. It's the public and the public engagement and political leadership and private sector leadership that can help. The ratcheting mechanism is there. How do we ratchet up faster to make sure that we deal with this? So beautifully put. And with the Marshall Islands, you really captured the world's attention last year when your story, came to the forefront around Paris. How can we learn from that incredibly emotional, resonant? How can we work with you going forward? How can the people in the room help support the Marshall Islands, but also how can we work together to make sure that we do act and we do ratchet things up fast enough?
Well, first let me comment, Christina, on your forceful and very eloquent statement on the importance of the Paris Agreement. I couldn't agree more with what she says. I really don't know what we could do, but I think going back to what I've said earlier, we need to engage the private sector. We need to have more public awareness. I think part of the problem is that we in the small island nations like the Marshall Islands are acutely aware of climate change and sea level rise, because every time there is a king tide, it comes right next to my house. So I know what it's all about. And so it's a matter of waiting for the sea level rise to rise up to the point where either I climb a coconut tree or I have to row a boat somewhere. And maybe some country will invite me and have me land on their shores. But I think it's important that a dialogue between the big countries and the small island nations, and especially the private corporations, private citizens, try to engage and educate the public about the importance of maintaining the momentum that is there with the Paris Agreement and going beyond that, like Christina alluded to. But the most important point is to get the public to be aware that of the urgency of the issue. That is really not a question of it's not a question of a small nation having to migrate somewhere else, but it's a question of a whole country losing their identity. It's a question of people losing their identity. The question then revolves around what do you do with a country that is no longer there? Do they maintain their fishing rights? Because that's part of our economy, comes from selling a license for other countries to come and fish in our waters. Do we lose our fishing rights? Do we lose our right to the minerals underneath the water? What happens if we have to leave? Do we lose our seat at the United Nations? Because if we lose our seat at the United Nations, we're no longer a country. Then what are we? That needs to be explained to the general public, that this is what's happening. And it's not just the Marshall Islands, but you think about a lot of small islands out there in the Pacific, and then in Indian Ocean too, and Bangladesh. Part of those countries will be underneath the water. Manhattan too. We're sitting here in New York. If sea level continues to rise, Manhattan may be underneath the water. So I think the most important thing that we could do is educate the general public of what's happening, especially the public in the bigger countries where maybe there is not as much awareness of the issue as we in the Pacific and other parts of the country are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I did want to announce, it's being officially announced later this week at the UN, but Good and the United Nations Foundation and National Geographic and a bunch of the UN groups and C40 and a number of the groups that came together last year to build Earth to Paris are planning the next chapter of that we're rolling out through Marrakesh, and then ultimately it'll be Earth to Los Angeles, Earth to Dubai, Earth to wherever in the world people need to take this action. So we are rebuilding, the Earth 2 coalition, and I'd be happy if any of you wanted to participate in that, because we will be trying to create as much public engagement as possible to ratchet this up as fast as possible and make sure that we ask. Martin, in terms of what you're seeing, it's incredible how your business acumen and sort of pegging the risk has really helped people realize that business as usual is uninsurable and can't happen. How do you take this and maybe apply it to other issues, or how can you take this to help make sure the ratcheting happens up, faster?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, after the last two contributions, it feels a shame for me to have to say something about the insurance industry again in a way. But I actually think the public-private piece have very common and similar objectives, but we're divided by an uncommon language. We don't always speak about the issues with the same descriptions, the same labels. So you need tenacity to get underneath what your counterparty is describing and discussing to get to that common knowledge, and it's worth investing the time and having the focus and the commitment to do it. I think in the case of the insurance industry, there's a trust element. I won't take a poll of hands of how many people have either personally or family and friends have had difficulties with insurance companies. But we have to put our reputation on the line, particularly in these issues around climate change. And we're trying to invent products and innovate that gets the money moving very fast, days, not weeks or months. So we're trying to do our bit. So I think in terms of supporting Christina, I think this sense of urgency is the big issue. So we say up there, the time for climate action is now. The slide could be 10 years old, and I don't want to see it again in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time. It's now, capital letters.
And as somebody raises their hand, I don't know if you want to respond to the carbon price question that the person asked. Yeah, since they.
I would certainly agree that having a price on carbon would be very helpful, just because of the obvious principle that when you put a cost on something that you don't want, it aligns interests. The problem is that, if we had had the challenge to get 195 nations to agree on a price of carbon, we would be, into 3016, not 2016 by now. And that is just practically, it certainly would have been impossible last year, and I think it's going to be very difficult to do that as an agreement, as several people wanted a price of carbon to come out of Paris, and that was pretty clear to us that that was not possible. What is possible is that we are pricing carbon, in fact, in 40 to 50 jurisdictions, and those prices are having price discovery through different methods. 2/3 of them have to do with cap and trade systems, different types of cap and trade. 1/3 of them have to do with some kind of a tax. But there is already price on carbon coming through the system, through the economy. And of course, whenever we want to look at scale, we look over to China. So the fact that China will be bringing its 7 pilot projects that it has running right now of 7 different market systems or 7 different pricing systems in 7 different large cities, much larger than my country, any of those cities, means that those 7 pilot, they will be brought together into one market system in China the next year. And if China goes for a single price on carbon for the entire China, that is really going to have huge ripple effects throughout the world. So if there's one thing that will accelerate pricing carbon, I think it is a price coming through in China. In the meantime, what we see is a mushrooming effect of carbon prices with different conditions and different terms coming through from the different systems, with the advantage that each of those is actually tending to the circumstances of the jurisdiction in which they're being developed, with the disadvantage that each of those represent self-standing systems, and that in order to have fungibility across the system, which makes it financially much more or economically much more efficient, that they have to engage in very, very protracted negotiations in order to be able to link systems. So that linking that is currently going on of market A to market B to market C is very, very complex and very time-consuming. And it's always been our view that you can still respect the mushrooming approach where everyone comes up with their own carbon price, but that if you could agree to international standards so that you know that a ton of carbon in Japan is the same as a ton of carbon in Costa Rica, the same as a ton of carbon in the U.S. and a ton of carbon, wherever else in Chile, because you have international standards, that you could basically plug your system into that international standard and thereby then achieve fungibility, which would be, or at least equiparancia, what is that, equivalence. And that actually would be a very good next step. So whether countries, will be moving in that direction, and that is one that is on the table and is being discussed, or whether it's actually going to come through a national price in China and then sort of take over, remains to be seen. But I don't think, crystal ball, I don't think we will have a price on carbon in the next 3 to 4 years. And I think that would be even pretty optimistic.
Any other questions from the audience here in the front?
Thanks. Amy Christensen Global and the Sun Valley Institute for Resilience. It's following on the conversation about a 2-degree world, or over a 2-degree world, being uninsurable. There was an event in Paris where investors managing over $1 trillion in investment got together to talk about the risks and opportunities. And they talked about a 4-degree world and research that Mercer had put out, and really saying that a 4-degree world is completely uninvestable. There's just nothing to hedge. There's no upside. It's entirely unpredictable. And so you would think that investors would be realigning their investments from the risk side, but also towards these opportunities. And we're just not seeing the numbers we need to see, as we've been talking about. And so I'm curious, as an insurer with so much money under investment, which you're stewarding carefully because of these crises where you're the people we turn to what extent are you all realigning your investments both on the risk side to mitigate the threats to those investments, so from a resilience lens, but also on a mitigation side, getting the money moving early so that others who may not be as aware can follow you? The vehicles are out there, but we're just not seeing the money move, so I was curious. Thank you.
Thanks. It's two sides I'd like to address. One, it's very hard to generalize for the whole of the insurance industry, but it's a huge, huge topic within the industry. I mean, we've probably got something like 70 trillion of assets under management, and there's lots of places we'd like to put our money, but we are restricted to the credit we get for that amount of money on certain asset classes. So that's so the regulator says if it's a fixed asset class, it's not very liquid, construction projects, building projects, and so on, then we might give you an 80% haircut on how much money you put in there. In terms of getting our investments in a climate-friendly environment, there's a lot of conversation going on. And for example, there was a Bank of England paper probably a year ago now, which talked about whether they should regulate the types of investment classes you're in or offer encouragement and so on. So mining stocks came under a lot of scrutiny. There's been a lot of debate and conversations there. And I think voluntarily the industry is going to slowly move away. But the concern of the Bank of England is looking at whether you create some sort of systemic problem that you have stranded assets, which then upset the global financial system. So they don't want to regulate and stimulate that. So on the asset classes, we have the first thing we do is match all our liabilities by duration and making sure we have the liquidity to pay the claims. Then we have a free float, which we can do something to try and make the money work a little bit harder, but obviously our resilience is most important for the claimants. On the asset side of the balance sheet, the opportunity to invest in building projects is something that we're very keen on as Swiss Re, and we're working with others, including the World Bank, to actually say you can unleash some of that $70 trillion for economic stimulus. You can make it into climate-friendly buildings and locations and so on. But for us, there are a number of things that are for us to be able to do. So first, a regulator would have to take a kind of view, but it would need to be a globally tradable asset class, because as our assets and liabilities move, we might need to change our positions. So we don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility, but it's probably, if Christina's optimistic about a carbon price in 4 or 5 years, I'd probably be optimistic about this tradable asset class in 5 or 10 maybe. So it's a problem. I will steal the swallow the alarm clock analogy on that one.
I think there's another question over here.
Thank you very much. I'm Heikki Holmes. I'm former Minister of International Development in Norway, now member of Parliament. I have a question for Christiana, and that is on negative emissions. I
thought you were going to say negative interest, which is also interesting, but go ahead.
No, I'm thinking about negative emissions. I mean, most of the trajectories for us reaching a 2-degree target, and we are now being more ambitious, leads to some sort of negative emissions from the atmosphere in the second half of the century. Now, that means a lot of bio-CCS, carbon capture and storage, in the second half. I cannot imagine a positive business case for bio-CCS competing and outcompeting solar and wind in 30 years' time. So my question is really, do you see such a positive business case for bio-CCS? Or does this add up to the urgency that you are talking about on why it is so important to being able to reduce the emissions more rapid than what the IPCC really is recommending?
Yeah, exactly, because the longer we wait with the global peaking and the descent, I mean, obviously the curve of the descent is also going to make a difference. But the longer we wait, the more we would have to rely on negative emissions, and that can be a whole family of issues, a whole family of technologies, what would be able to give us the negative emissions. But we have to be able to balance. There's no other question, no question about that. So the question is, can we, within the next 5 years, can we invest enough to shift energy patterns, A? Can we invest enough to actually shift the natural absorbing capacity of forest and agricultural lands to help us with that balance so that we wouldn't have to then move into all of the different kinds of CCS or CCUS, in fact, that is out there, that it has a huge gamut and a huge array and a huge bandwidth of different options, but that carries its own risk. And we really don't have the comfort of knowing what the consequences are. And so it just doesn't seem to me to make a lot of sense of, we're living in a risky world anyway, to then bring in technologies that are of high risk to deal with a risky situation. Somehow that logic doesn't quite, get into me. And I would rather that we then use the technologies that we do have, and we know from the IEA that we actually do have the technologies right now. It's not a question of having the technology, it's a question of the dissemination, the cost, and the cost of capital. The cost of the technology and the cost of capital to be able to disseminate those technologies quickly enough to the areas where it really makes a huge difference. And so we do have the potential is there to be able to avoid a very, very risky scenario. It's a question of pace. It's a question of intent. And I think the islands should get a huge round of applause for an amazing step forward that most of the islands have made, where even with the difficulties that they have, they want to go 100% renewable. Good on them, right? It makes a heck of a lot of sense, because these islands are paying sometimes 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 cents a kilowatt hour. That's absolutely crazy. Why? Because they have to import this fossil fuel and transport it halfway across the world. So it makes no sense when they have the sun right on top of them. So good on them for moving on that. And at the same time, let us understand that that is not going to change the projection of emissions. We have to get to those point sources that are actually the highest points of emissions, and those are going to make a difference in the quality of life of islands. So the islands are actually, sandwiched in the situation from both sides. But there is, frankly, no excuse. There is no excuse for all of us picking up from where we are, rolling up our sleeves, working with each other. As you have said, the problem here is, that the corporate sector has this language, don't even ask me what climate negotiator language is, completely ununderstandable to anybody else. And it's a very different, no, it's true. And so it's very difficult to bring these communities together. And it is communities that do need to be talking to each other. The insurance, because they're institutional investors also, not just insurers, they're institutional investors holding 70 trillion and could really make a big difference. The other institutional investors should also be on board. Pension funds, hello? Other big institutional investors. But those are typically investors, as you've heard, that they have to manage their liability in terms of how many years they're holding that liability. So very often the institutional investors can't take the first risk. They can't take, and that's why I was saying before that that's the role of public capital, to be able to buy down some of that risk, to understand the local circumstances and the political risk, in order to then be able to shift that capital.
So we've heard a 2-degree world is uninsurable. Business as usual leads to the Marshall Islands being underwater, and many assets here in New York, all around the world. We know this story, and we heard really powerfully the business case, the emotional case, and the need to ratchet up our intensity to this urgency for climate action, so that we don't see this slide in 10 years from now, that this transformation that has been outlined so beautifully in Paris is realized. And I thank you all for joining, and please give a round of applause for our great panelists.
Ladies and gentlemen, the breakout session is now concluded. Thank you for attending.